Can I welcome everyone to the 27th meeting of the Local Government and Communities Committee in 2019 and remind everyone present to turn off their mobile phones. We've received apologies today from Andy Whiteman. Agenda item 1, the committee is invited to consider and agree whether to take agenda items 3 and 4 in private. Item 3 is consideration of evidence heard today in relation to the Scottish Elections Reform Bill, and item 4 is consideration of the committee's future work programme. Are we all agreed? Agreed. Thank you very much. We're all agreed. The committee is also invited to agree that a draft of the letter that we will write to the Standards Procedure and Public Appointments Committee following today's evidence session on the Election Reform Bill will be considered in private at a future meeting. Are we all agreed? Thank you. That's agreed. The committee will take evidence today in agenda item 2 from representatives of the Electoral Reform Society and Local Government Boundary Commission for Scotland. The purpose of this session is to inform a letter we will be writing to the lead committee, which is the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee, making recommendations on the bill at stage 1. Whereas the SPPA is looking at the bill in the round, our focus will be on aspects of the bill affecting local government elections. This morning I welcome Jonathan Shaffey, Campaign Managers, Campaigns in Scotland Electoral Reform Society, and Ronnie Hind, Local Government Boundary Commission for Scotland. We will move on to questions from members, and I'll start with Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. It would be quite useful to get your view on the proposals of extending the local government term from a 4 to a 5-year term. Views and opinions on that. Thank you.
Okay, I'm happy to start.
Thank you.
From the Commission's point of view, we're agnostic, but you'll see from our submission that it does have some implications for the work that we do. So I think the main point I would want to make is that whatever term is decided, we think there's value in preserving the stability, as I would characterise it, of the current arrangements whereby the reviews that we carry out either for local government or for the Scottish Parliament, all other things being equal, will endure for 3 elections. There's nothing magic about the number 3, but I think it served us well in the past, and I think we should be thoughtful before we lost that and went down to a reduced number of elections, which would be one of the possible outcomes depending on the permutations that are taken. And I suppose associated with that, our main objective as a commission would be to make sure that we're able to schedule and time our reviews consistent with the principles that we like to use. The first one being that we finish our work in good time for the proposals that we put forward to be considered and then adopted and put into law before the next election, so a year roughly of grace between those 2 events is important for us. And also the second principle is that the data that we use should be as up to date as possible. We don't want elections to be conducted on the basis of electorate data that we've had to use, which is 3, 4, 5 years out of date.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of that. I think in particular around data, you'll probably see from our submission that, broadly speaking, if we've not mentioned anything in particular in terms of a response, then we're broadly okay with the proposals. And I guess our starting point is that lots of what's contained we don't have much of a problem with, but there are some deeper issues that we need to uncover as part of the discussion to really rejuvenate democracy in Scotland. But just to echo that in particular when it comes to data, that would be a key concern.
And do you think that there are any real disadvantages from either one system or the other on the timescale, or do you believe that there are real advantages in creating a 4 or 5 year term, and the impact that has? And you specifically touched on data, and it's vitally important that you have the most up-to-date, the correct, so that you are dealing with the information and communicating that out. So do you think there are real advantages or disadvantages to having one or the other?
I mean, to be honest, I think that the difference when it comes down to it in terms of how we would go about renewing our democracy, I think is relatively marginal. As I say, we don't have any great opposition to it, but I think that it's really the wider and deeper issues that we've been trying to pick up on in terms of our response. Not to say that this isn't, of course, an important issue. We want to see, elections being seen as something that people, dare I say, look forward to. that it's part of our social fabric. And in particular, when you look at local elections and you look at turnouts, we've done quite a body of research which showed things like people would rather do the ironing than go out and vote in a local election. So I guess what we are saying is these things are important, but we want to get into some of the issues as to why people feel that barrier of engagement. And I don't think that it's too much of a difference in terms of that.
Of course, part of the problem here for this morning is that we're dealing with one section of the bill. I mean, you'll be digging deeper to a great extent with the lead committee on this.
Yeah.
Sorry, Alexander.
That's okay. And Ronnie, do you have any?
Well, as I said, we're agnostic, but I suppose if I was to make one further observation, it would be that you can see from our submission that it takes a fair length of time to do a review of local government. So again, all other things being equal, if it's roughly 30 months from start to finish, you can see that deadlines get a little tighter if you're working within a 4-year period rather than a 5. But we've always satisfactorily managed that in the past, so I wouldn't say it was a huge issue for us. The one thing that might be changing going forward, and there's other aspects of the provisions of the bill that you might want to come on to that touch on it, is that we are trying as a commission to engage more deeply with councils and with communities in the work that we're doing. We're currently trying to do that under the auspices of the Island Act. So that takes more time. And we, again, see no reason why it can't be done with 4-year intervals as opposed to 5, but you can just imagine that with a bit more time, there might be more opportunity for some toing and froing around some of our proposals and the counter proposals that we hope to see coming from councils and indeed the public.
And you know, when the Scottish Government themselves looked at the length, there was no real consensus as to what was expected. But it's the understanding of the electorate view on the whole process as to how they believe and what they think. Because as you've identified, there is a different view about a local government election in comparison to others. Individuals seem to put them in a different category. And that is because turnout is always and has always been less, it would appear. So they give it a less priority themselves. So their view and opinion is that they vote with their feet. They don't turn up to the polling station because they don't see the opportunity, or they don't feel that they're engaging enough with that. And in reality, it may well be the case that that's the one election that individuals do have the most involvement at a local level. For those of us who have in the past on this committee served as councillors, you know that you're at the coal face much more than maybe an MP, an MSP or an MEP, depending on their role and responsibility. So, as I say, there was no real consensus in that process, but it would be good to think of what your views on what the electorate think of that whole process and how that might be changed, or how that might be looked at going forward with this process.
All of that is extremely valid, because we want to involve people in this decision-making process. We've been doing a lot of work up and down the country, taking various proposals and having debates and discussions about how we'd like to see local government run, including the kinds of questions that have been raised so far. And again, just to say, while there's this discrepancy, as you've correctly pointed out, in terms of how people view elections, we've also found, not just anecdotally, but backed up by polls, backed up by events that we've held, that people are willing to dedicate time and energy to the local area. They want to do that, but they don't see the connection between that form of engagement and going to elect local councillors or take part in a local election. So the more that we can involve the electorate in this process and shaping the kind of local democracy that we want to renew and to build in Scotland, I think is all to the good. So the more of that, the better.
Yeah, it's a slightly different point, but on the same subject of 4 versus 5. Because I think there's quite a strong argument for saying it should be 5 years on the basis that that leads to kind of better government, if you like, because whoever gets elected at whatever level, whether it's council or Scottish Parliament, will have a programme. And if it seems to me, if it's a 4-year term you're elected for, you're pretty soon having an eye onto the next election, and that might affect what you do or you don't do. So I'm personally quite comfortable with 5 years, because I think that gives whoever the government is, council or Scottish Parliament, longer to carry out a programme. Have you got any thoughts on that?
I think there's a tension here that we want to ensure that the electorate feel that they are as in touch as possible and have as much control as possible over their elected representatives, and of course the rate at which they are allowed to elect representatives is very important to people. And at the same time, I think we also want to avoid that culture of political parties of any stripe making promises at election time which are running thin with lots of the electorate now, having that longer period of time to implement a programme which may be a more strategic programme, whether that's on the economy or democracy or any other aspect of political and social life. So there is a tension there, and the way I think that we would look at it is we want to have a holistic approach. So if we were to have longer terms, for example, let's also increase engagement. Let's also have other mechanisms that we introduce that allow the electorate in the intervening time to play a full part in their democracy. While there's a focus on kind of some of these rather technical aspects about exactly the time length and so on, we want to press time and again that notion of building in other mechanisms that allow us to have a fuller discussion about that.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, I'd like to move on to the issue. You've both given us some really good evidence on about the size of council wards and how many councillors we should have and how to achieve proportionality, and then to work out how to get the best balance between that. And I think it is a fundamental issue, and it'd be good to draw on experience or thoughts that you've got of how things have worked since that proportionality was introduced, and we went from single member wards to a much more different approach. The first question I want to ask is whether you think the proposals in the bill will improve representation by giving more increased flexibility to different circumstances that we have across the country. And I know you've both put evidence in, so I'm keen to get both your views on it.
I'm quite happy to start. Well, yes, as a Commission, we welcome the additional flexibility. Limited tools in the box when it comes to ward design if you can only choose between permutations of 3 or 4. And I think we've said previously to this committee, and we've certainly said in public and in publications, that there were circumstances that we identified during the last set of reviews where we could have come up with a solution that had a 2-member ward in a number of the mainland councils, or less frequently, but nevertheless occasionally, a 5-member ward. So the fact that the bill offers the prospect of using those as well as 3 and 4 is something that we can only welcome. Our view as a Commission at the moment, because we're just coming to terms with how we might implement that in practice, we're looking obviously at the islands. At the moment where a 2-member ward is a reality, as is a 1-member ward. So the discussion that we're having with the island councils at the moment is quite interesting in that regard. Our view is that there's nothing that we would prefer intrinsically in terms of the choice between, as it stands, 1, 2, 3 or 4, and therefore by extension, if it went to 5, we would see them all as having equal value. It's not objective, in other words, to use 5-member wards or 2-member wards. But we do recognise that there is perhaps an issue lurking in the background to do with the effect on proportionality. When the choice is between 3 or 4, you can still find, I think, occasions when the way that proportional representation works within wards differs a little bit depending on whether it's 3 or 4 members. It's not pronounced, it's not profound, but it's nevertheless occasionally there, and elected representatives could give you a better account of it than I could. So what I'm really saying is we should be thoughtful about how that might work in practice if we then start to use 2 and 5-member wards too. Now I recall that when the proportional representation, the multi-member ward system was introduced back in 2004, I think 5, there was talk then about reviewing it after it had been in place for a while. We can't find any evidence of that having been done. And I do think that that would be a valuable exercise as we move into the bill if it becomes an act. So that we can be conscious as we're using these options of what it might mean in terms of the chemistry, if you like, within a council. And the last thing that I would say is that we have asked the 3 the full island councils, they're the ones we've had the most the closest engagement with so far, whether they've thought about that, and would it make any difference as they see it to how members see themselves in the council chamber? And by and large, they don't think so, although nobody has yet thought hard enough about what it means if you've got a single member ward, for example, with other people, which is proportional in name, but in practice perhaps not, and then 2, 3 and 4 member wards where it is proportional representation. So I think we'll see how that works out in practice.
I do pick up that point about review. Maybe we want to come back to that one. Thank you. Jonathan?
Yeah, I think much to agree with. You'll probably see from our submission that, generally speaking, we welcome this in the sense that it does offer greater proportionality, but that there are some far deeper issues that we have to contend with, and I think that's probably recognised. For example, yes, parity between wards, that clearly is an important issue, but we also want to make sure that our elected representatives have some real ties with the communities that they represent. And you don't always get that. I understand the need for that kind of parity. I understand also what's been said around numbers of councillors. But when it comes to that, Scotland, as you'll know, is very far down the list of democracies when it comes to the level of representation that people have. Ideally, what we want to see are more councils, smaller, more reflexive, more representative and engaged councils with larger numbers of representatives being elected. We think that will rapidly increase the levels of engagement that people have. Now, we also say that if you look at the kind of blueprint that we've put forward, I say blueprint, it's really a discussion document to start a kind of debate around how we might do that. We recognise these are complicated issues and they're not easy to grapple with, but nevertheless, given where Scotland presently is, we think we can do a great deal better, and I think we've tried to outline how.
So there's not really concerns about the number of councillors returned to wards between the two of you. You're broadly in favour of the flexibility. I'm picking up from you, Ronnie, that we definitely need to review this. I'm thinking about, as somebody who's been both a constituency and a regional person, there's different dynamics, but in the councils, that's going to play out differently as well in terms of size of constituencies. I'm also interested about, are there lessons from other countries that you could learn from, that either of you have looked at? It partly picks up your point about representing people better, but the trade-offs between proportionality, density, rurality, community, and then there's the issue about an access to an individual constituent. So if it's a 5-member ward, how you know who to go to, who's the nearest councillor, and then what's your political representation. It's quite a lot of work you're kind of expecting constituents to do. Have you got views on the accessibility and the numbers trade-off?
Well, yeah, I could offer a couple of comments. You mentioned have we looked at other places? Yes, we've looked at evidence, so far as we can find it, of how the multi-member ward system works in other polities. The example I think that was cited most often before the legislation was enacted back in 2004 was Ireland. But I can't find very much evidence there that there's been any review work done to say how well or badly does this form of representation work in Ireland. Jonathan might know more about that. So we have, because we've been thinking about it and been casting about to see whether there is any evidence about what it's like to be a councillor in that situation, and I can't find terribly much, although I'd be happy to be guided somewhere by anybody who knows better. I could reflect a wee bit on my own experience as a chief executive, and I wouldn't want to dwell on that too much, but we were very conscious of it in my council, and no doubt in others as well, and a bit of concern about how it would work out. And I think in practice what we tend to find is that regardless of the political party that's represented, there's a recognition that in a multi-member ward there has to be some form of kind of sharing of responsibility, and it works as well or as badly as people can make it work. The reason that I mention that is because I think resilience is quite an important issue. If you've got a 2-member ward and one of them happens to be ill or unavailable for a period of time, you can see that it becomes an increasingly large burden for the one left. If the 2 of them are unavailable, that becomes quite an issue. So it's less likely to happen as you go up the scale towards 4 and potentially 5. So there is a benefit in terms of what we think of as effective and convenient local government, that there should be actually somebody who's there to represent the people that they've been elected to represent. And so 2 and 1 obviously pose more serious risks about that. But in terms of accessibility, I think it's a trade-off, because you're right, there's someone there to whom one can go. But if it's a 5-member ward, you could be covering quite a large geography, potentially, if it was a rural council area. And it may well be that the fact of having a 5th or a 4th member compared to the 3 that you may previously have had isn't much use to you because they're just so far away from you and your access to them is very limited. So there will be trade-offs there.
Okay, Jonathan?
Yeah, I think I think also important to say that we want to change the culture when it comes to standing for local elections. In many countries, it's very normal to be an elected councillor. It's not seen as any great political intervention. It's seen as something which is part and parcel of your civic duty. And there's all kinds of statistics that we can look at. Norway, there's mention of France and other places in the submission, where you look at just how close people are to their representatives. I mean, we're looking at representatives for several hundreds of people rather than of thousands of people, and that ratio has to be closed in on. There's also another point which is about communities, and when we use the word communities, because I think it was sort of rightly pointed out there, we have the geographical problem, but communities are also very complex things. We think that in order to rebuild community, actually, there needs to be a democratic renewal. We see the things as being very closely aligned with one another. So we need to ensure that as this bill develops, that there is as much consultation as possible. We are doing our bit by taking meetings across the country where we're involving people in this discussion. And I'll just end by saying that what comes up very often is there are actually huge numbers of people who would be very interested in becoming councillors, in becoming local representatives. Lots of them deeply embedded in their communities, many of them in political parties, but many not. And actually, we need to give those people the opportunity, because it's through that opportunity that we think we're going to maximise the engagement. So I also welcome the view that we want to review this. We understand that this is complex, but we want to be as ambitious as possible.
So just to add to that, one of the suggestions I think you make in your representations to us is that we should have more councillors. Would you add more councillors with the current number of councils we have? Or is the priority more councils? Because you could make a marginal change, and we could take up Ronnie's suggestion of actually reviewing this process. Would that make a difference? And you've quoted statistics to say people support it. Would it have cost implications as well?
I mean, that's a very good question, because you could throw more councillors at the present setup of regional councillors and not actually end up with much improvement in terms of people's engagement. We do want to see more councils. We think that actually the two come hand in hand. It's very difficult to talk about more councils and less councillors, for example. So we want to see an increase in both councils and of representatives. As I say, that will of course involve cost. If you look at the document at the end of the submission that we've put, it outlines some of the details around that. We want to also see development councils and the introduction of citizens' assemblies at a local level. All of that costs. Our argument, though, would be, just very finally, is that there is a much greater cost in not renewing how our democracy at a local level in particular works. We think that with increased democracy, we will see increased levels of community involvement, which I think breeds all kinds of economic and social benefits.
The reason I was kind of trying to push you on this one was because I can see the argument, but in this bill, you're not going to get a lot of new councils, or you're not going to change councils.
Yep.
Your only thing you could do in this is have more councillors and a variety in terms of the trade-off between accessibility, size of wards and numbers. Is it worth having more councillors, or do we just make the system work as it is and play around with the numbers, as you've now got with the opportunity in this bill?
So just to be clear then, more councillors, of course, we would take, but what we're really worried about is that there is no way to gloss over some of the issues that we have to grapple with. And therefore, it would be very easy for the bill to go through with some tinkering round the edges, though we'd welcome that, because we see this as being part of a process. We see democracy always being part of a process and of an evolution. But we'd like to see deeper and more radical proposals come forward and to take this opportunity. We think it comes at a key moment in politics, and therefore taking the opportunity is something we'd advise.
Okay, that's all.
Kenny, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I mean, loads and loads of stuff here. I mean, to be honest, actually, convener, because first of all, I don't know if you share my view that this is a fairly limited bill. To my mind, it's a missed opportunity. I think we could have done a lot more. We could have covered a lot more ground on that. I mean, Jonathan, you said that we should be looking wider and deeper. And one thing that's not included in your submission, for example, is two major flaws, I believe, in the current proportional representation system. And I would say that I was the person who put forward in the 1995 SNP conference the policy of bringing STV in for elections, which was actually quite hard fought. A lot of people were against that. They preferred a different proportional system. And I have to be honest with you, I've been deeply disappointed in its impact. And there's two reasons which I think should have been in this bill. One is the fact that it was believed that parties would put up robust candidates and the voters would choose between those candidates on their merits. We now know that doesn't take place. The most important thing in any council election when there's two people from the same party is your surname. So, for example, Alistair Allen, all else being equal, will always defeat a William Wilson. And I looked at this in just after the 2007 election, and there was a 92% weighting towards the alphabet, and the further up the alphabet, the bigger the difference is. So do you believe, first of all, that there should be a randomisation of ballot papers? I mean, I've asked the Minister previously why the SNP does it in internal ballots, but the government doesn't bring it in a bill like this. I believe that should be to try and eliminate that. And secondly, the other issue why STV was to have to come in was to encourage more people to come forward. But in actual fact, political parties have become unbelievably timid. So, for example, I look at Largs ward in my own constituency, a 4-member ward. So what happens? The Tories think we can only win one seat, so we're only going to put one person up. And home and dry, before the ballot's cast, Labour put one up, the SNP actually put 2 up, and an independent stands. So the electors have got 5 people, 4 of whom are going to be elected. It's not really what we thought was going to happen. Fewer and fewer people are now standing for election than ever before. At least under first past the post, Largs would have been 4 wards, and the SNP and Tories and Labour would have contested, and probably independents would have contested them all. Fewer people stand as well because it's onerous, the size of the wards, and that goes on to what was actually being said earlier by Sarah. I've got a ward in my constituency called Dalrine West Kilbride. I mean, you know, not just a car, you just about need a helicopter to represent it. It's 30-40 minutes across. And it's basically, the Electoral Commission basically they've selected 3 and 4-member wards, and then it's almost been the bit that's been left over. And it's bears no resemblance to the communities it represents. It's just all bits that have all been glued together. And I think if someone doesn't have a car, they can't really represent that area. It's just so... You know, and I've raised this by your predecessor, Ron, and he just said, well, we made a mistake in 2007, we're not going to change it. I mean, that was literally was the answer, and you can look the record back up if you don't believe that. So there's a number of issues here. First of all, how do we actually ensure that we get more people to stand in these multi-member wards if we're going to continue with them, which we clearly are? And how do you overcome these barriers of the parties being extremely cautious, and also the issue of randomisation, you know, the issue of alphabet?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with almost everything there. I think that there's, before I come on to some of the more detailed points, I think there's a danger, and you might find that somewhat counterintuitive that the Electoral Reform Society would say this, but there is a danger that we look to electoral systems as some kind of magic wand to increasing engagement, increasing representation. Now, clearly, we support proportional representation. We support STV. We want to see those. We want to see those systems develop. But we also think that there's a wider democratic crisis that's going on, and therefore we have to think about this in the following ways. I mean, for example, we conducted a campaign called "Act as if we own the place." There's some details which we've provided for you. what we do is that we go into a community and we take people through a process using deliberative techniques that they come to decisions about the problems in their area, the solutions, what they might do about it. Now, that's just one small example of the kind of mechanisms that we could deploy that would allow people to become involved more generally in their area. And I think that has an impact when it comes to elections. So we have to have joined up thinking. It's not just about the electoral system, it's about the wider culture and other mechanisms that we want to have. On the detail of what you say, I think you've raised real problems. I mean, the way political parties often approach local elections, as you've outlined there, I think does and can breed wider disengagement and wider disenfranchisement with people's relationship with a local election, because people can see this happening. And so we want to avoid that kind of approach. That's going to require, again, a long-term, systemic, but also cultural change in the way that we do politics at a local level. And again, to reiterate, we do think that the best way forward would be to increase the number of people that actually take part in these elections. We can only do that if we increase the number of councils and councillors. You can see how then that would begin to change both the culture and the dynamic around local representation.
So you would support randomisation of ballot papers, I take it, so that somebody like Jonathan Shaffey is not, has a more difficult chance of being elected than an Annabel Ewing in the same ward, for example. So you support that.
Yes.
How do we get... I mean, I don't know how we're going to get political parties to put up more candidates and think they're going to get elected. I think that's going to be a real issue, and I think that's a major flaw in the system. But Ronnie, the point I talked about when I mentioned that ward, Dalry, Portncroft, Dalry, West Kilbride, I mean, what weighting do you put on community as opposed to numbers? Because it seems quite clear that numbers are the absolute overriding criteria. Although my constituency and Cunningham South are both in North Ayrshire, Cunningham South, the wards are there's about 2,500 voters per elector. 2,500 voters per council, whereas I've got about 3,000, and I don't understand why there's that differential. And your predecessor was unable to really explain that. There should really be if you're going to look at numbers, you look at numbers. But there seems to be a kind of issue where communities are not prioritised over the numbers.
Okay, well, I mean, I'm not familiar with the details of the Dalry ward, but go back to my opening comments. It may well be that that's a function of the limited choice available under the current system, where you can only have 3 or 4. If you could have 2 and 5, you might be able to draw lines. You should be able to draw lines quite differently. So if there's a conspicuous problem in terms of accessibility of transport through an area, then that's one of the factors that we would look at. So I can't promise in the specifics, but I think that's my general response to that. In relation to the wider question about parity versus communities, well, you know what the legislation says. It remains the case that parity is paramount, and that's the legislation with which we work. And it does lead to, I think, occasionally painful accusations that we're just number crunchers and so on. But I take a view about that, which is parity is really about fairness. That's the objective here, is to make sure that in representative terms, every person's vote in a ward for a council, just to stick with local government, as near as can be, counts for as much as every other person. So if you've got wide disparity within a council area, that is not going to be the case. Now, that's a starting point, it's not the end point. So we do have other provisions in the legislation that we do make use of. We've got disparities in areas like Highland, I think, that are into the 20s and even 30% in some of the wards, because we recognise the importance of special geographical circumstances, and that's really the tool that we have at our disposal when we try to bring things like communities into focus here. And also we're obliged not to break local ties in the course of making our ward designs, unless there turns out to be absolutely no alternative to that. So we're very cognisant of community in that sense. But, I mean, you'll know this as well as I do. To quote an academic that we've asked about this, community is in the eye of the beholder. So sometimes it's a geographical thing, sometimes it's social and economic, sometimes it's cultural, it's all sorts of different things. And nothing in the legislation that we work with gives us the sophistication to recognise those different forms of identity. So the best we can do is speak to the councils, and the one thing, I'm just sorry, Kensington in a second, the one thing that we're trying to get out of the work that we're doing at the moment with the island councils, and that we'd like to take into the reviews in the future once this legislation is in place, is the opportunity to spend more time speaking to councils and to local representatives other than councillors about what community means for them, so that we know to some extent what we're talking about when we weigh that in the scales against the numbers.
I mean, I do think parity is important. I mean, you know, for example, in my constituency, or North Ayrshire, 3% of people live in Arran, and there was an argument that they should have a multi-member ward, and I said, well, no, because I wouldn't want a vote in Arran to be worth 2 or 3 times more than a vote in the mainland. I don't think that's appropriate.
Yeah.
But I mean, there has to be some flexibility in terms of, you know, 5, 10, 15% on the mainland if you're going to get community representation. I mean, how do you think this bill can be improved in terms of this, if at all, or do you think the bill has got it just about right?
Well, I come from a different position in this, obviously.
Well, I'm asking you both.
But yeah, so our position is we'll work with whatever the legislation says, and we've given some observations you see in our submission about how the proposals as put forward could be improved from our point of view. If you're talking about bigger issues, I don't expect the government to be able to give us a very clear definition of what a community is and how best to take that into account in a quantifiable way that would then be set alongside the things that we can measure. I think the expectation in the Islands Act, just to stick with that for a second, is that we try to recognise quite distinctive forms of community that you get in island areas. And as I said a minute ago, we are doing our best to recognise that in practice. But it always is going to come down to a matter of judgment. And speaking for myself now, I won't be the chair of this commission forever, I probably wouldn't want to have judgment fettered on the part of a commission. I wouldn't want anybody's definition of a community, not even the government's, to be the defining criterion that we had to use when we said, how do you weigh this against that? I think we're better trying to speak to people who are in the area and get an understanding of what it means for them, because it will vary right across the country.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is really good to hear that there is a recognition that there is a tension between this question of parity and actual community representation, and also that there is a discussion to be had about what we mean by community, because as it's been outlined, it can mean many different things. One of the aspects of this that we've found is that in many ways community is also used as a kind of buzzword for something that actually may not even exist. There's been a lot written and said about this in lots of academic texts and lots of polling evidence and all the rest of it, that shows that actually there's been quite a substantial breakdown in what people understand the community to be for all kinds of economic, social and other questions. And so we think that there is a missed opportunity, you use those words when it comes to this bill, to start to address some of that, because actually we think that the question of how communities develop has to be and is intrinsically organic to how democracy functions. They work very much in the same way. They share a dynamic that we want to enrich and nurture. And we think the best way to do that is by taking the opportunity, which we think this bill, as it presently stands, doesn't go far enough on, by introducing other mechanisms which I've tried to outline.
I realise others want to come in. Can I just touch on one other thing then? And that's because I believe in a radical transformational government, full stop. But anyway, council by-elections or casual vacancies, as you put in your submission, Jonathan, here, I'm not really understanding the logic of the ERS's position. Basically, what you're saying is that there's a by-election, right? 3 years from after a council election, a by-election, and you're saying the next person on the party slate of candidates who failed to be elected should just basically step up. Well, that person could have died, emigrated, joined another political party. The whole political landscape could have changed. For example, in the last few months, there was a new political party, the Brexit Party, formed, which did exceptionally well in the European elections. Doesn't look as if it's going to do well in the next one, but things change. So why should that happen? And you also said, should the seat be held by an independent if there's no party candidate available and the ballot papers in the last elections were recounted as if the previously elected council wasn't there? I mean, how is that democratic? Surely it's much better. I know that you're desperate to avoid anything but a first past the post election, but surely either the current system would be better than that, or even just a first past the post, given it's a by-election. I mean, surely, well, I have to say that your submission here seems to me to be the worst of all possible worlds. So I'm just wondering what your thinking is behind it.
Well, I think that when it we obviously don't want to see any kind of seeping towards, shall we say, things like a first past the post election. We want to retain the electoral systems that we have and improve them, of course, but we think that you do that by engaging in the kind of wider work that I've tried to outline in terms of other mechanisms that we want to see function at a local level, which you can see in the document that comes after our submission. So if you look at that, I think that should that be running alongside the kind of issues that you've raised that come around when it comes to something like a council by-election, then actually it's not as big a deal as it may first seem, because it's coming alongside a range of other democratic mechanisms. So you see that we want this to be a holistic approach. It's not just about looking at how it exists in the here and now. It's about how would this function alongside all of our other proposals, which you can see in the document that we've provided.
Yeah, I could come back on that. I'm desperate to, but I know there are people that come in. Just thanks very much for your indulgence.
Annabelle.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, gentlemen. Just briefly, listening to the wider conversation and going back to the issue of the number of wards. I mean, for example, in Fife, as Ronnie Hines will know well, there are 22 wards. I'm afraid I don't know the figure for Scotland nationally, but I mean, in broad brushes, you know, picking up on earlier points, what is the optimal position? Is 22 for Fife, for nearly 400,000? What is the optimal? What should we be striving for in an ideal world?
Well, sorry.
So I should declare an interest, and we're going to use Fife as the example. That's not the way I look at it. I mean, I don't think there's a right answer to these questions posed in numerical terms, so I would say that about the number of councils, the number of councillors, and I guess by extrapolation about the number of wards as well. So we don't have an objective when we do our work to have an outcome that says there's a given number of councillors in Scotland as a whole. We don't have that as an objective for individual councils either. And because of that, that's what drives our work in ward design. So the number of wards that you get in an area like Fife or anywhere else is a function of the methodology that we use rather than as an objective of what we're trying to do. I suppose if I'm trying to reflect partly on my current role and what I would know from previously, I'm not sure that the number of wards is a big issue for the council itself either. What we're tending to find more, and I think it's worth bringing this point out, is that the way that councils try to map their wards onto other things that are of higher importance to them by and large, which would be, for example, the way that they work with other community planning partners. So they'll try to come to arrangements that are mutually convenient so that they can get the best out of those relationships with health and police and other bodies. And that's where we will find that the question of the number of wards comes sharply into focus for us in our work. So an example would be from the last reviews. North Ayrshire are very strong on community planning. It's a key part of how they do their work. I have to say, it's all on the record, I know, something that I look at and admire because they put a lot of effort into it and you can see that they get results. So we were not able to come up with a result that they were absolutely happy with because it didn't map accurately onto those arrangements. The reason we couldn't do it is because they're not part of the relevant considerations that we have to take into account. But moving forward, and they will be now in scope for the Island Act, we'll be having a conversation with them about how best to do that. So for me, the number of wards comes into focus in that context. So there's no right answer to it. The council could change its mind tomorrow and reshape it differently in terms of how they work with their partners. So that's a factor for me. But anything that we could do that would be supportive of that, I would tend to think of in the same way as we try to think of local ties. It's a different issue, but it's the same principle.
Okay, John.
Yeah, I think I've been at lots of different meetings where elected representatives ask the same kind of question. And often who's got the best answer is people who live and work and reside in the areas which those representatives are engaging with, right? So what I'm proposing and what we always want to see more of is to involve people in that question, to involve people in that process. Let's ask and let's seek guidance from the electorate, the local electorate, as to what would be suitable, as to how best they could be represented. Because in the end, they know far better about the geographical questions, the community questions that we've already touched on. And that's the kind of process that we want to see kind of develop. I mean, just another kind of, this is just as an anecdote, but one of the meetings that we ran recently, there was a discussion about what, and this was in Leith, there was a discussion about where the boundaries of Leith were. And actually there were different ideas about that depending on how you related to that area as a community. But the discussion itself actually ended up with some really important proposals, I think, about how those residents would like to see themselves represented in a geographical area which they've had a discussion about.
Okay, thank you. Interesting.
Thank you. Graham?
Thanks, Convener. I just want to go back on a couple of things first, if I can. So first of all is the issue of the number of councillors per ward. Jonathan, in your submission, you come up with well, let's to be nice about it, call it a radical idea that we could have up to 9 councillors per ward. Which sounds astonishing. I'm not quite sure how that would work. Perhaps you can explain, before I come back at you, the rationale behind that.
Well, it's again, there's no magic number. I mean, at no point do we assume that there is a number which you can scientifically calculate, which is going to be the optimal number. But what we're saying is that the increase in number of councillors in wards will have a positive net impact, generally speaking, but that's of course coming alongside there being more councils and other democratic mechanisms running alongside that. This has to be viewed in its totality and not just in its technical detail, as if these issues weren't interconnected. So I think that on that basis, the kind of thing that we're talking about is increasing representation, increasing the number of councillors, and as I say, coming alongside an increase in the number of councils themselves. So that's the kind of approach that we take.
But I'm not clear why having 9 councillors as opposed to 3 or 4 leads to let's call it a better quality of representation.
Well, one thing that would do, for example, is it would allow more people to put themselves forward. I mean, you can debate whether or not that increases quality of the individuals, but what we're talking about is the quality of engagement. And you're far more likely to have increased engagement and an increased democratic dynamic if you have more councillors and more representatives able to respond to local people's needs. But also, that's about building the culture of having people put themselves forward, and we're far more likely to get that if there are more councillors on offer.
Right, so what would happen there, let's go for the 9 figure, is you would get electors emailing 9 people about the same issue, and so then 9 councillors would contact people like Mr. Hines in his previous job with the same issue. So that creates a bureaucratic headache. That's not better. Now, I live and I used to represent as a councillor a 3-member ward. Now, currently, so I just regard myself as a normal voter. If I wasn't involved in politics, I would have absolutely no idea who any of my councillors were, because none of them communicate with the electors, none of them. One of them's in my own party. So I think the voters, I think that's generally the case, in fact, that most voters will have no idea who their councillors are. So whether you make it 3, 4 or 9, it's not going to change. It depends on who your councillors are and how effective they are.
I think actually that's a very fair point, because the idea that just saying that we have 9 instead of 3 or 4, as if that's going to answer all the questions that you put there, I think would be wrong, especially when you talk about the doubling up of queries and concerns that people put forward. Are these going to more councillors than need be? These are all questions that I think that we do have to tackle. We want to be clear that the things that we are putting forward are very much to start discussion, but I would say to you that if you look at the document that we've provided, that we do see this running alongside a range of other mechanisms. So when it comes to, for example, big projects in an area, how are those decided, how are those carried out? We want to see things like development councils and citizens' assemblies to help the process, to make sure that there is that broader backdrop of civic engagement at a local level. But I do accept what you're saying about some of the issues that may arise as a result of that, and also do accept that what you say about there being a doubling up of queries, a bureaucratic problem, I think that's fair comment, and it's something that we have to look into. My response is to say that what we've tried to provide as part of an overview of how we'd address that involves other mechanisms that would run alongside electing these councillors.
Okay.
Well, just briefly, I think Graham Simpson's question touches on what I said earlier in response to Sarah Boyack. So I repeat, as a commission, we are agnostic about the number, other than the fact that we welcome having more choice. But I did say previously that I think it's worth asking the question, where's the evidence to suggest that one form of proportional representation is better than another, or that any form of it is better than the old system where we had single member wards? And I think there is a piece of work that should be done, to be honest, following the fact that we introduced a multi-member ward STV system in this country over a decade ago. And the only thing I wanted to add to that is that that should include a look at other polities that do have these systems. So some of the bigger numbers that Jonathan's alluding to might sound large in our terms, but actually things not unadjacent to that exist in other countries not very far from us. In Ireland, you can have up to 7. In fact, that's what's recommended for the multi-member ward system in Ireland. They set their face against 3 or 4. Now, I'm not saying they're right or they're wrong. I'm just saying other people with comparable, I think, polities and economies have come to a different view, and I could cast my net further afield to New Zealand, although I'm not offering to go there, because I think that they have looked at this as well. So if we are going to look at it, we shouldn't just look at how it's worked in this country since we implemented it. We should look a bit more widely for comparators and see what lessons can be learned.
I don't want to spend too much more time on this, although I know that both Sarah and Kenny want to come in very briefly, but is it fair to say that your proposal here isn't really appropriate for this because it's about part of, you think the bill's too narrowly drawn, and this would really be part of the continuing conversation around the local democracy and how you see it being? I mean, you can't just say that, you're not saying, I'd imagine that with the existing system and with what we've got in the bill, we should be putting in 9 councillors, because that would lead to the duplication and stuff that's already been mentioned.
Yeah, exactly. So we want to put forward the idea that this has to be a much broader discussion, that it's an evolving discussion, and that actually the opportunity that exists, if we were to take it, to implement some of the things that we're advocating in this bill. You know, the time to be putting forward the kind of ideas that we are, and I would say as well, I think this is important, that our proposals that you can see haven't just come from the Electoral Reform Society, they've come from a coalition of people through a lot of debate and discussion with all kinds of organisations, and they want to see this kind of thing emerge. So we're not going to get all that in this bill, we understand that, but we want to be the people that are making sure that we're pressing for as much as we possibly can throughout the process, and it is an evolving process.
Thank you. Sarah, Kenny, if you want to come in very briefly.
Just a very brief follow-on, because earlier you said that tinkering is better than not making any change. And I was just reflecting on the 9-member ward versus having that 9-member ward split into 2 and having a 4-member ward and a 5-member ward. If you're trying to actually increase access to representatives and access to communities, there are trade-offs that you have both very eloquently described to us and what boundaries you're both working with. But I was thinking that would enable you both to increase potentially your number of members, but also retain the issue of proportionality. And I totally get the parties don't put up 3 candidates in each 5-member ward, because potentially you can end up losing all your councillors. So there are calculations to be had here, but it's trying to make something that would potentially be better, be proportional, give a bit more capacity. So I was surprised you didn't seize on the opportunity of going, well, why couldn't you have slightly more people, but you still got proportionality and you've got more access to representatives, if you think that's a key issue.
Kenny, I'll ask you to come in as well.
Yeah, sorry, it's just, I mean, I represented a 1-member ward in Glasgow City Council for 7 years in the 1990s, and I have to say I'm reconverted back to first past the post, having seen the appalling flaws of the current system, and one which I didn't touch on is complacency. I mean, I think one of my concerns about the current system is candidates, some of them feel, you know, you talked about that at your ward. If you come third in the next election, you're still going to get elected. If you come fourth in a 4-member ward, you're still going to get elected. So as long as your pals in the local branch put you forward as a candidate for Party X and your party gets, with 5-member ward, 16% plus 1, or a 4-member ward, 20% plus 1, or a 3-member ward, 25% plus 1 of the vote, you're home and dry for another 5 years. And I think that's a real issue. So you've got complacency. So, no, I'm just saying that you complacency, you've got fewer people being put up by party candidates. I mean, younger people can't actually stand or break through, and then you've got the issue of the alphabet, making it difficult for people, you know, as well, and skewing the results. So these are all reasons why I think the current system really has to be, as Ronnie says, reviewed, and I would certainly hope changed.
Okay, thank you. Don't feel you need to respond, but if you want to, then feel free. Okay, good. We'll just move on. We'll go back to Graham, and he'll ask the questions that he was going to ask originally.
Right, if you want me to do that, I can do that. But I just want to ask about something else we've already touched on, convener, which is it will be brief because I think it's an omission in the bill. I couldn't see it, but we've mentioned it previously, and that's about by-elections. And there'll be different views on how by-elections should be done. I mean, do we keep the current system, or should by-elections for council elections be first past the post? There'll be a variety of views, but I couldn't see anything in the bill. So do you think there should be something in the bill that tackles the by-election issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to be honest, if we're going to be looking at the way our local democracy works, we have to look at every aspect of it. I think that's going to breed confidence in the system that we come up with and that we end up with. We oppose first past the post elections. I hear the criticism that's been put forward. I do want to reiterate that we don't think any electoral system in and of itself is ever going to be perfect. I don't believe that a perfect democracy works. We want to seek to increase all the time the way representation is reflexive to the needs of its electorate. But I think that all aspects need to be covered. This is an important piece of legislation. It has to have confidence of the electorate. It has to have the confidence of representatives as well. And therefore I think it should look into all the aspects that that may come up as a result of that kind of process, and that is certainly one of them.
That's a matter for the Electoral Commission rather than us, so I've nothing to say on that.
Okay. Now, this committee has previously looked at this wider issue, and I remember being quite surprised to discover that you could be registered to vote in two places. I was even more surprised to discover that you could vote in two places at the same time in council elections. So if there's council election on the same day, you know, I could vote in Edinburgh and I could vote where I live in East Kilbride. So I could vote in two places. I'm not allowed to vote in two places in the general election or in the Scottish Parliament election, although I could be registered in two places. To the best of my knowledge, there is no effective system for checking if I've abused that. So if I chose to vote, if I chose to be registered to two different places and voted in two different places, I'm not aware of any effective system for checking if that has taken place.
No, but you would be committing an offence. Just I point that out. The lawyer,
Well,
just helpfully. Free advice.
Yeah, yes,
for
and,
business, Annabelle, and let the man get on.
I think I've covered Miss Ewing's advice because I said you are not allowed to do it. Yeah. What I said is I don't think there's an effective system for checking whether you've done it. Are you aware of any?
Well, again, it's out with our remit. It's a matter for the Electoral Commission, so I should remain silent, I think.
I think it's important because there's clearly been a discussion, which is a wider discussion that's taken place, which involves things like voter ID, for example. That's something that the Electoral Reform Society sees as a mechanism that would suppress voter turnout, for example. So I hear the concern, absolutely, that obviously we don't want people voting twice in an election or in different areas in the same election. But we do need to balance any mechanism that is used to prevent that kind of thing emerging. We do need to balance that against wider voter suppression that may take place as a result of things like voter ID, for example. So I don't have any concrete answer, I'm afraid, to give on that, but I do accept absolutely this has to be looked at, but it has to be looked at in a way which is not going to deter people from voting.
So the bill doesn't propose to change the system where anyone could be registered in two different places, or maybe 3 different places. So question, should it?
Yeah, it should.
And the bill goes on to tackle the issue that I mentioned earlier of somebody voting in a council election twice. Currently, they're able to do that. The bill would mean they shouldn't do that. They would not be allowed to do that. So I think that's positive. That's only if there are council elections on the same day. So you could have by-elections. I mean, I could vote in a by-election in Edinburgh. I could vote in a by-election at home, currently under the bill proposal. So a number of issues there. So should you be able to be registered in 2 different places? So that's my first question.
I think no, but I'd also say that I'd like to look into this in a bit more detail and provide some more, as I say, more detailed response to this. Because I think you do raise an important question. It's not something, I have to admit, that we've looked at in any great detail, though now that you have raised it, I think that we will certainly have a look at it and see what we can make as a proposal to your committee for you to scrutinise. As I say, the one thing that we would be, just thinking about it just now, the one thing that we would be looking to avoid is that any mechanism that would prevent that kind of thing happening, it shouldn't involve barriers to voting for the wider electorate. But certainly that's something that we'll look at, and I'd like to circulate something on that.
So it's just, it's really easy to be registered in multiple places, and then we've got a general election coming up. I know that's not our remit, but you'll have people there deciding where they should vote based on where their vote is going to be most effective in their view. I mean, surely that's wrong.
And also points to a wider flaw in the system itself. If people feel that their vote is wasted in one area but not in another, for example, I accept that. But yes, I think that this should be looked at. That we have to ensure that there is a robustness, that there is a level of trust in the system, and a level of trust in who's voting in our democratic system. It's something that we'll look at as a result of your question, and I'll certainly circulate something in terms of a response from ERS on that, because I think it is an important issue.
Okay.
Let's concentrate on the remit of the committee, which is local government.
Well, I think the issues, convener, affect all elections. I mean, being able to be registered.
There's 2 different setups in place for the different elections, parliamentary elections and local government. Sorry, Kenny, Annabelle wanted to come in first.
Briefly, yeah, I mean, I suspect that the possibility of dual registration takes us back to a different era, and, you know, reflecting if people were working away or students or whatever, having to spend some time away from their own home, where it would have been more cumbersome to register to vote or change your registration. But obviously that doesn't pertain now with online applications and so forth. So it seems to me it would be very timely to look again at this issue, because there doesn't really appear to be any need now, even if you could argue that there once was, but certainly not now, for the possibility of being registered in 2 entirely separate places.
Yeah, and I think that it's also an opportunity, and again, I'll circulate this as part of our response. I think it's also an opportunity to to look at voter registration in the main when it comes to how we're engaging with people. You look at the number of people who are not registered. We have to look at initiatives that we can conduct that will increase the numbers of people on the electoral roll. So I think there's a real discussion to be had around this issue of registration, which encompasses a number of different areas, and certainly we will do some work on that and circulate.
Go right to the committee with
yes, with some more detailed response to that. Yeah,
Kenny, briefly.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, that's the point I was going to make. There's far more people that are not registered than registered at 2 locations. I mean, in my constituency, some of the more deprived areas there are streets where you might have closes with 8 flats in them, and there's only 2 or 3 voters registered in the entire close, which is completely unacceptable. And I think that's a real major flaw in our democratic process. But surely in this day and age, when you register at one address, that should automatically go to your previous local authority if it's in a different local authority, and they should just delete you from the electoral register there. One would have thought that mechanism should be very straightforward, and one would have thought that COSLA would be able to ensure that its member councils do that. I think this is, but I do think it's an issue. I think it's less of an issue than the people not being registered at all. And I think that the UK government has made it more difficult, I believe, for people to register. For example, in this general election, you can get a proxy voting form, a postal voting form, but you have to register online. And for people who are not computer savvy, that's a disadvantage to them voting.
Right, thank you. Graham, do you want to come back in on anything? No?
No, that exhausts that line of questioning.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. The Scottish Government's consultation on the rolling review of local authority wards, 71% of respondents supported the rolling review of the boundaries. Can I ask, this is more a question for you, Ronnie, I suppose. What's your view of that? Are you supportive of the proposals for rolling reviews?
Well, you'll see from our submission we can see advantages and disadvantages to doing it. The main disadvantage potentially could be a lack of consistency in the approach that we take because we're not covering all 32 councils at once. I would say as the chair that that's a risk that we could manage because our methodology is consistent. So it would be changes in circumstances in which the methodology was being applied that might give rise to some at least perception of a consistency. On the other side of the equation, the balance, the advantages rather, could be quite substantial. I've already alluded to the opportunity it might give us to engage more fully and deeply, both with councils and in one form or another with the electorate and or community organisations within the council area that have got an interest in our work, which, to be frank, given the resources that we have, is very difficult to do when you're doing all 32 councils at once. You can see what an exhaustive process that is. So that is a potential advantage, and I would say it's in the spirit of both the Islands Act legislation and, I think, what lies behind some of the provisions in this legislation. So we would be quite happy to work in that fashion. The question that we've posed in the submission we've given to this committee is whether the provisions in the bill as they stand actually give effect to rolling reviews. Because the way in which the timescales are set out for the periods of the reviews would make it hard for me to see how we could in practice actually be doing rolling reviews, in the sense that you might be doing 6 or 7 councils at a time and then another 6 or 7. So, and that's what I think is intended by the expression rolling reviews in the policy memorandum, and I don't think the provisions in the bill as proposed actually give rise to that.
Okay, on that note then, I'll just conclude the public part of the meeting, move this meeting into private, and thank you both for your time this morning. Thank you.